The torrential rain beat down on Penelope Lawrence's thin shawl as she clutched her twin babies tighter to her chest, their wails nearly lost in the roar of the swollen creek that had washed out the only road leading to Bannack, Montana. It was 1867, and she had traveled too far to turn back now, even as the mud sucked at her boots and threatened to pull her down into the churning waters. "Just a little further," she whispered to her 3-month-old sons, who squirmed against her, their tiny faces red with distress. The older one, Samuel, had finally cried himself to sleep, but little Matthew continued to whimper, sensing his mother's fear. Penelope had been walking since dawn, having been abandoned by the stagecoach driver who refused to risk crossing the flooded creek. With her husband dead from typhoid just 2 months after their son's birth, and no family left in Virginia, she had sold everything to make this journey west, answering an advertisement for a schoolteacher in Bannack. The mining town desperately needed educated women, the letter had said, and offered good pay and lodging. But now, as the skies darkened further and the rain turned to hail, pelting her and her babies mercilessly, Penelope felt her strength failing. Her arms trembled under the weight of her twins. Her dress, soaked through, clung to her legs, making each step a battle. When her knees finally buckled at the edge of the washout, she didn't immediately notice the tall figure approaching on horseback through the curtain of rain. It wasn't until a deep voice called out over the storm that she looked up, blinking water from her eyes. "Madam, hold still," the rider dismounted in one fluid motion, splashing through the mud toward her. His face was partially obscured by the wide brim of his hat, but Penelope caught sight of piercing blue eyes set in a weathered face as he knelt beside her. "Give me one," the cowboy said, nodding at the twins as he stretched out strong, calloused hands. "I'll carry both if needed." Penelope instinctively clutched the babies tighter. "Who are you?" she managed, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Isaac Owens, madam, ranch foreman at the Silver Creek spread just outside Bannack," he gestured toward her precious bundles. "Those little ones are getting soaked through." "My cabin's just over that ridge. Let me help you." Something in his steady gaze broke through Penelope's fear. This man, with his broad shoulders and calm demeanor, exuded a quiet strength that seemed like salvation in her desperate moment. With trembling arms, she surrendered Matthew to him. The cowboy tucked the baby expertly against his chest, sheltering the small body beneath his oilskin coat. Then, without hesitation, he wrapped his free arm around Penelope's waist, supporting her as she struggled to her feet. "Come on now," Isaac urged, guiding her toward his waiting horse. "Just a little farther." The massive chestnut stallion stood patiently in the rain, steam rising from its hide. With Matthew secure against him, Isaac helped Penelope mount first, passing Samuel back to her once she was settled. Then he swung up behind her, one strong arm circling her waist as he took the reins in his free hand. "Hold tight," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear as they set off through the downpour. The journey to Isaac's cabin seemed both endless and over in an instant. Penelope, light-headed from exhaustion, leaned back against the solid wall of his chest, focusing only on keeping her grip on Samuel as the horse picked its way carefully along a narrow trail that wound up through pine-covered slopes. When a small log cabin finally came into view, nestled against the hillside with smoke curling from its stone chimney, Penelope could have wept with relief. A covered lean-to served as a stable where Isaac guided his horse. "My friend Daniel tends to things when I'm away," he explained, noting her surprise at the waiting fire. "Looks like he's been by today." Inside, the cabin was simple but immaculately kept. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall with a cooking area beside it. A table with 2 chairs stood in the center, while a bed with a colorful quilt occupied one corner. Shelves lined another wall, holding books more than Penelope would have expected in a cowboy's cabin. "Let's get these little ones dry first," Isaac said, already laying out blankets near the fire. His competence with the babies surprised her as he unwrapped Matthew's wet swaddling and expertly dried the infant with a soft flannel cloth. "You have children?" Penelope asked, following his example with Samuel. Isaac's expression flickered with something like pain before he shook his head. No, madam, I helped raise my sister's boys after her husband died at Gettysburg. They're grown now, living with her in California. Once the twins were dry, wrapped in warm blankets and settled on a makeshift bed of quilts near the hearth, Isaac turned his attention to Penelope. He disappeared briefly into a small side room, returning with a flannel shirt and wool trousers. My sister left some clothes last time she visited. They'll be big, but they're dry. He handed them to her, then turned his back. I'll make some coffee while you change. Penelope hesitated only a moment before peeling off her sodden dress. The dry clothes were indeed too large, but the blessed relief of warmth overrode any concern about appearance. She rolled up the sleeves and pant legs, using a length of twine from her pocket to cinch the waist. Thank you, she said as Isaac turned back, offering her a steaming cup. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along. Isaac's weather-lined face softened. What brings a woman alone with 2 babies to these parts, if you don't mind my asking? Penelope sipped the strong coffee, letting it warm her from within before answering. I'm to be the new schoolteacher in Bannack, my husband. Her voice caught. Thomas died of typhoid 3 months ago. There was nothing left for us in Virginia. Isaac nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than pitying, which Penelope appreciated. Bannack's a rough town, but it's changing. More families settling now that the initial gold rush has calmed. They'll be glad to have a proper teacher. And you? Penelope asked. What keeps you in Montana territory? Isaac moved to check on the twins before answering. The land, he said finally. Been saving to buy my own spread. Got my eye on a nice piece of valley land south of here. He gestured toward the window where the rain continued to fall. Storm like this is good for the grass, bad for traveling though. How far are we from Bannack? About 10 miles as the crow flies, longer by trail. Road won't be passable for at least a few days with that washout. He hesitated. You're welcome to stay here until then. I can sleep in the lean-to with Thunder. Penelope's cheeks warmed. I couldn't put you out of your home. It's no trouble. Besides, he nodded toward the window, that rain's fixing to turn to snow by nightfall, temperatures dropping fast. As if to confirm his words, a gust of wind rattled the cabin's shutters, and Penelope shivered despite the fire's warmth. The thought of her babies in the cold galvanized her decision. If you're certain it's no imposition, we'll stay until the road clears. I'm very grateful, Mr. Owens. Isaac, please, he replied with a small smile that transformed his serious face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. And it's no imposition. Been a while since I had company that didn't have 4 legs or a badge. The storm worsened as evening fell, just as Isaac had predicted. The rain turned to sleet, then to heavy snow that piled against the cabin windows. Inside, however, was a cocoon of warmth. Isaac proved to be not only a capable host, but also an excellent cook, preparing a hearty stew from venison and preserved vegetables that tasted better than anything Penelope had eaten in months. After dinner, when the twins woke hungry and fussy, Penelope nursed them one at a time while Isaac politely busied himself with chores. His lack of embarrassment at the natural act surprised and relieved her. Thomas had always left the room when she fed the babies, uncomfortable with what he considered a private matter. When both twins were fed and changed, using clean cloths Isaac provided, Penelope settled them back on their quilt bed. To her surprise, Isaac knelt beside her, studying the babies with obvious interest. They don't look much alike for twins, he observed. Penelope smiled. Samuel takes after his father, the dark hair and eyes. Matthew has my coloring. She stroked Matthew's downy blonde head. Their personalities are different too. Samuel is serious and watches everything. Matthew is all smiles and wiggles when he's not hungry or tired. Strong boys, Isaac said with approval. You've done well by them, traveling so far on your own. The simple praise brought unexpected tears to Penelope's eyes. Since Thomas's death, she had received plenty of pitying looks and concerned clucking from neighbors, but little acknowledgement of her strength or capability. I didn't have much choice, she said, blinking back the moisture. Thomas left debts. The bank took our home. Teaching is all I know, and Bannack offered the best wage. Isaac's hand briefly covered hers, a fleeting, warm pressure that disappeared almost before she registered it. Courage isn't about having choices, he said quietly. It's about facing what comes, head on. Later, despite Penelope's protests, Isaac insisted on sleeping in the stable with his horse, leaving the cabin to her and the twins. As she lay in his bed, listening to the wind howl outside while her babies slept peacefully nearby, Penelope realized it was the first time since Thomas's death that she felt truly safe. Morning brought a transformed world. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow that sparkled in the early light. Penelope woke to the smell of coffee and the low rumble of Isaac's voice as he spoke softly to one of the twins. Opening her eyes, she saw him by the fire, Matthew cradled in one arm as he stirred something in a pot with his free hand. The infant was staring up at him, tiny hands reaching for Isaac's beard. "Is he bothering you?" Penelope asked, sitting up. Isaac turned, a smile warming his face. "Not a bit. This little man's been keeping me company while his brother sleeps. Hope you don't mind I picked him up when he started fussing. Didn't want him to wake you?" "I don't mind." Penelope pushed back the quilt and crossed to them, taking in the domestic scene with a strange flutter in her chest. There was something both incongruous and perfectly right about seeing the tall, rugged cowboy holding her tiny son with such gentle competence. "I made oatmeal," Isaac said, nodding toward the pot, "and there's coffee." They fell into an easy routine over breakfast. Isaac asked about her plans for the school in Bannack, listening with genuine interest as Penelope described her hopes for bringing education to the frontier children. "Most folks here value learning more than you might expect," he told her. "Especially the miners who never had much schooling themselves. They want better for their children." "And what about you?" Penelope asked, curious about this thoughtful man who seemed so at odds with her preconceptions of frontier cowboys. "You have quite a collection of books for someone who spends his days with cattle." Isaac's eyes crinkled. "My mother was a teacher back in Pennsylvania, insisted all her children learn to love reading." He glanced at his bookshelf. "Books keep a man company on long winter nights." After breakfast, while Penelope fed and changed the twins, Isaac went outside to check the trails. He returned with snow dusting his shoulders and hat. "Main roads still blocked," he reported, stamping his boots clean. "But there's a game trail that should be passable by tomorrow if no more snow falls. I can take you to Bannack then, if you're set on going." Penelope nodded, ignoring the small part of her that was relieved at the delay. "I should report to the town council as soon as possible." "They're expecting me." "Well, we won't be going anywhere today," Isaac said, hanging his coat by the door. "Too dangerous with the little ones in this cold." He glanced around the cabin thoughtfully. "Might as well make ourselves useful. How are you with bread making?" The day passed in a blur of domestic activity that reminded Penelope of her early marriage, before Thomas's business troubles had soured his temperament. She and Isaac worked side by side, kneading dough, mending clothes, and caring for the twins. Isaac showed her how to split kindling properly and explained his system for preserving vegetables through the harsh Montana winters. In turn, Penelope shared stories of her teaching days in Virginia and sang the folk songs her grandmother had taught her. Isaac had a surprisingly good singing voice and knew verses to some ballads that Penelope had never heard. By evening, the twins had taken to Isaac completely. Samuel, normally wary of strangers, allowed the cowboy to rock him to sleep, while Matthew gurgled happily whenever Isaac came near. Watching him with her sons, Penelope felt a dangerous warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling she quickly tried to suppress. She was a recent widow with 2 infants, heading to a new job in a frontier town. Isaac was a bachelor cowboy saving for his own ranch. Whatever this fleeting connection between them, it couldn't lead anywhere. She couldn't afford to let it. Yet that night, as they sat before the fire after the twins were asleep, the comfortable silence between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. "Tell me about Thomas," Isaac said suddenly, his voice low in the quiet room. Penelope looked up, startled by the request. "Thomas, your husband." Isaac's eyes reflected the firelight. "If you don't mind speaking of him." Penelope considered the question, realizing it had been weeks since anyone had asked about Thomas as a person rather than as a tragedy. He was ambitious, she began slowly. Brilliant with numbers, could calculate sums in his head faster than most men could write them down. He had plans to open his own bank someday. She paused, remembering. He courted me for 2 years before my father gave his blessing. Thomas was from a good family, but they lost everything in the war. Did you love him? Isaac asked, then immediately looked contrite. Forgive me. That's too personal a question, but Penelope found herself wanting to answer. I did, she said honestly. Not perhaps with the passion you read about in novels, but with a steady affection. We were comfortable together. He was a good man. She glanced toward her sleeping sons. And he gave me them. Isaac nodded, his expression thoughtful. I was engaged once, he offered unexpectedly. Her name was Alina. We grew up together in the same town. What happened? Penelope asked when he didn't continue. I went to fight for the Union. Came back to find she'd married a banker who'd paid to avoid service. His mouth quirked in a humorless smile. Can't blame her. She wanted security, I wanted adventure, and did you find it? Adventure, found enough of both kinds to last a lifetime. Isaac's gaze grew distant. Saw men at their best and worst during the war. Afterward, I couldn't settle back into Pennsylvania life. Came west with nothing but my horse and the clothes on my back. Do you regret it? Not once. His eyes refocused on her, suddenly intense. That's the thing about life, Mrs. Lawrence. You make your choices and you live with them. No use wondering about roads not taken. Penelope, she corrected softly. If I'm to call you Isaac, you should use my given name. A slow smile spread across his face. Penelope, he repeated, and something in the way his voice caressed the syllables sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The next morning dawned clear and cold. After breakfast, Isaac went to Saddle Thunder while Penelope packed her few belongings and bundled the twins in every available layer of clothing. The prospect of leaving the cabin's warmth for the arduous journey to Bannack filled her with apprehension, but she knew delay would only make things harder. When Isaac returned, his expression was grim. We have a problem, he said without preamble. There's a wolf pack moving through the valley. Fresh tracks all around, not safe to travel with the babies. Penelope's heart sank. How long until they move on? Hard to say. Few days, maybe. He ran a hand through his hair, looking troubled. Wolves don't usually bother humans unless they're desperate, but this winter's been harsh. Game's scarce. We can't stay here indefinitely, Penelope said, trying to keep the dismay from her voice. The town council is expecting me. They might give the position to someone else if I don't arrive soon. Isaac nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. There's another option. My friend Daniel, the one who checks on the cabin, he's heading to Bannack today with a supply wagon. Sturdy vehicle, armed men, they could take you. That would be perfect, Penelope said, relief flooding through her. When will they pass by? They won't come this way. We'd need to meet them at the crossroads about 3 miles from here. He glanced at the twins. It's a risk, but less than trying to make it all the way to town. Penelope considered their options. 3 miles through wolf territory with infants was terrifying, but the alternative was potentially losing her new position and with it, her only means of supporting her sons. We'll go, she decided. How soon must we leave? Within the hour to be sure we don't miss them. Isaac began gathering supplies with efficient movements. I'll carry both boys, you follow close behind with my rifle. I've never fired a gun, Penelope admitted. Isaac paused, his eyes serious. Then let's hope you don't need to today. The journey through the snow-covered forest was tense and silent. Isaac carried the twins in a clever sling he'd fashioned that distributed their weight across his broad chest, leaving his right hand free for his pistol. Penelope followed in his tracks, the unfamiliar weight of the rifle awkward in her gloved hands. Every shadow among the trees seemed to move. Every crack of a branch under the snow made Penelope's heart race. Isaac maintained a steady pace, occasionally stopping to listen, his experienced eyes scanning the wilderness around them. They were perhaps halfway to the crossroads when Isaac suddenly froze, raising his hand for Penelope to stop. She held her breath, straining to hear what had alerted him. Then she saw a large gray wolf standing on a rock outcropping about 50 yards ahead, watching them with unblinking yellow eyes. A moment later, more shapes materialized from between the trees, moving with silent, predatory grace. "Don't run," Isaac murmured, slowly reaching for his pistol. "Stay behind me, move very slowly backward, one step at a time." Penelope's blood turned to ice as she counted the wolves, 5, no, 6 of them, forming a loose semicircle ahead of them. The twins, mercifully, were quiet, perhaps lulled to sleep by the motion of walking. They had retreated perhaps 10 paces when the lead wolf, larger than the others with a silver-streaked muzzle, took a step forward, lips pulling back to reveal long teeth. Isaac's gun was in his hand now, though he didn't raise it yet. "We need to change direction," he said, his voice preternaturally calm. "There's a hunter's cabin about a quarter-mile east of here. Move to your right, very slowly." Penelope did as instructed, her legs trembling so badly she feared they might give way. The wolves followed their movement, spreading out to maintain their position before them. One younger-looking animal darted forward a few paces, only to be checked by a growl from the leader. They had managed perhaps 20 yards in their new direction when a sharp crack, a branch breaking under the snow, startled the wolves. The leader barked, and suddenly the pack was moving, not directly at them, but in a flanking maneuver that would cut off their path to the cabin. "Run," Isaac commanded, drawing his pistol. "That way, don't stop until you reach a small clearing with a log structure." "I won't leave you," Penelope protested. "You'll take your sons to safety," Isaac countered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Go, now." Something in his tone galvanized her. Penelope turned and ran, crashing through the snow as fast as her skirts would allow. Behind her, she heard Isaac shout, followed by the sharp report of his pistol. A yelp suggested he'd hit one of the wolves, but she didn't dare look back. The forest seemed to close around her, branches clawing at her clothes and hair. Her lungs burned with the cold air as she pushed herself forward, following a barely visible trail through the trees. When she finally burst into a small clearing and saw the rough log structure Isaac had mentioned, she nearly cried with relief. The cabin was little more than a one-room shelter used by hunters, with a crude door and a single window covered with oiled paper. Penelope shoved the door open and stumbled inside, immediately turning to scan the forest edge for Isaac. Long seconds passed with no sign of him. Penelope's mind filled with terrible images: Isaac torn down by wolves, the twins helpless as their protector fell. She was about to rush back outside when movement at the tree line caught her eye. Isaac emerged from the forest, walking quickly but steadily, the twins still secured to his chest. Behind him, there was no sign of the wolf pack. Penelope ran to meet him, relief making her lightheaded. "Are you hurt, the babies?" "We're fine," Isaac assured her, though his face was pale with exertion. "Managed to wing the alpha. Rest of the pack lost interest when easier prey showed up. A deer broke cover not far from us. Lucky timing." Inside the crude shelter, they took stock of their situation. The hunter's cabin was basic, just 4 walls, a dirt floor, and a simple fireplace, but it offered protection from both wolves and the biting cold. A stack of firewood against one wall suggested the place was maintained for emergency use. "What about your friend's wagon?" Penelope asked as Isaac built a fire. "Won't we miss them?" "Probably," he admitted. "But Daniel makes the run twice a week. We'll catch him on the return trip if needed." As the small space warmed, Penelope unwrapped the twins, checking them for any harm. Both boys were remarkably unfazed by their adventure, Samuel blinking solemnly at the unfamiliar surroundings, while Matthew immediately began trying to stuff his fist in his mouth, his usual indication of hunger. "They're resilient little fellows," Isaac observed, watching as Penelope settled against the wall to nurse Matthew first. "Take after their mama that way." Penelope felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. "I'm not sure how resilient I feel at the moment. My legs are still shaking." "That's just the fear working its way out," Isaac said, stoking the fire. "You did well back there, kept your head. Most city folk would have panicked." "I'm hardly city folk," Penelope objected. "I grew up on a small farm in the Shenandoah Valley." "Is that so?" Isaac's eyebrows rose. You've got the soft hands and proper speech of a lady. My father believed in education, especially for his only child. He saved to send me to a ladies' seminary in Richmond. She smiled at the memory, but I still know how to milk a cow and plant corn according to the signs. A woman of hidden depths, Isaac said with a warmth in his voice that made Penelope look up sharply. The intensity in his blue eyes as they met hers sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with residual fear. They passed the day in the hunter's cabin, rationing the supplies Isaac had brought and taking turns watching for any sign of the wolf pack's return. By late afternoon, it became clear they would need to spend the night. I'll go out before dark to gather more firewood, Isaac said, checking his pistol. We'll want a good blaze through the night to keep predators away. Be careful, Penelope said, unable to keep the worry from her voice. The thought of Isaac facing the wolves alone made her stomach clench with fear. Always am, he replied with a reassuring smile. While he was gone, Penelope busied herself making the cabin as comfortable as possible. She cleared a space near the fire for the twins and used her shawl to sweep the dirt floor. A thorough search of the cabin yielded a few useful items: a dented tin cup, some salt wrapped in paper, and a moth-eaten blanket that she shook out thoroughly before deciding it was usable. When Isaac returned, arms laden with wood, his eyebrows rose at the improved surroundings. You've been busy. It helps to have something to do, Penelope replied, taking some of the wood from him to stack by the fireplace. Any sign of the wolves? None close by. Found some tracks heading east following what looked like deer trail. He added several logs to the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Should be safe enough here for the night. This cabin's sturdy. As darkness fell, the small space grew intimate. The twins slept side by side on a bed Penelope had made from her cloak and the found blanket, their peaceful faces illuminated by the dancing firelight. Isaac and Penelope sat on opposite sides of the fire, sharing the last of the jerky and hardtack he had packed. Tell me about your ranch plans, Penelope said, partly to distract herself from their precarious situation, but also because she found herself genuinely interested in this man's dreams. The land you're saving to buy. Isaac's face lit up in a way she hadn't seen before. It's beautiful country about 15 miles south of Bannack. Has everything a cattle operation needs: good water, sheltered valleys for winter grazing, high meadows for summer. His hands moved expressively as he described it. Previous owner couldn't make a go of it because he tried to farm wheat. Land's no good for crops but perfect for cattle. How much longer until you can buy it? Another year, maybe less if I'm careful with my wages. He poked at the fire with a stick. Town's growing, beef prices are strong, good time to get established. It sounds wonderful, Penelope said sincerely. A fine dream to work toward. What about you? Isaac asked. Is teaching in Bannack your dream or just a necessity? The question gave Penelope pause. She'd been so focused on survival since Thomas's death that she hardly remembered what it was like to have personal aspirations. I always wanted to teach, she said slowly. Even as a girl, I would line up my dolls and give them lessons, but now, she glanced at her sleeping sons. Now my dreams are for them. I want them to have opportunities, education, a stable home. You're giving them that, Isaac said. Taking them somewhere you can support them, even if it meant traveling across the country alone. That's more than many children get. His understanding touched her. Thomas, for all his good qualities, had never fully grasped her passion for teaching, viewing it as a hobby rather than a calling. Isaac seemed to instinctively recognize what drove her. What about you? She asked. No desire for a family of your own on this ranch you're planning. Something flickered across Isaac's face, a brief shadow of old pain. Figured that wasn't in the cards for me after Alina. Not many suitable women in these parts who'd want a weather-beaten cowboy with nothing but dreams and saddle sores to his name. I think you underestimate yourself, Penelope said softly, then immediately felt her cheeks flush at her own boldness. Isaac's gaze held hers across the fire, something kindling in his eyes that sent warmth curling through her despite the cabin's chill. For a moment, neither spoke, the crackle of the flames and the soft breathing of the twins the only sounds in the small space. The spell broke when Samuel stirred, making small fussing noises that indicated he would soon wake hungry. Penelope moved to tend to him, and the moment passed, though she felt Isaac's eyes following her movements. They took turns keeping watch through the night, though no dangers materialized. By morning, the sky had cleared to a brilliant blue that promised better travel conditions. "We should reach the crossroads by midday," Isaac said as they prepared to depart. "Even if we missed Daniel yesterday, we can follow the wagon tracks to Bannack." The journey proved easier than expected. The wolves had indeed moved on, and the bright sunshine made the forest seem less threatening. Isaac again carried both twins, who seemed to have decided he was a perfectly acceptable substitute for their cradle, sleeping contentedly against his broad chest. When they reached the crossroads around noon, they found not only clear wagon tracks but also a welcome surprise. Daniel's team was approaching from the north, heavily laden with supplies for Bannack. Isaac Owens, as I live and breathe, called the driver, a stocky man with a magnificent handlebar mustache. "Was getting worried when you didn't meet us yesterday." Introductions were quickly made, and Daniel proved only too happy to give Penelope and her twins passage to Bannack. His wagon was crowded with goods, but they cleared a space among the sacks of flour and barrels of salted pork. As Isaac helped secure her few belongings in the wagon, Penelope felt a strange reluctance building inside her. The last 3 days had created a bond between them that seemed wrong to sever so abruptly. "Thank you," she said inadequately when the moment of departure arrived. "For everything, we wouldn't have survived without you." Isaac adjusted his hat, looking uncharacteristically awkward. "Just doing what anyone would." "Not anyone," Penelope contradicted. "Not everyone would have risked wolves for a stranger and 2 infants." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with things unsaid. Then Daniel called that they needed to get moving to reach town before dark. "I'll check on you in Bannack when I come to town next," Isaac said finally. "Make sure you're settling in all right." It wasn't a goodbye, Penelope realized with a flutter of hope. "I'd like that," she replied, and was rewarded with a smile that stayed with her long after the wagon pulled away, Isaac's tall figure growing smaller in the distance as they rattled toward her new life. Bannack proved both better and worse than Penelope had expected. As a former territorial capital now settled into life as a prosperous mining town, it boasted amenities surprising for a frontier settlement: a hotel, several mercantiles, a newspaper office, and even a small lending library. But it also retained the rawer elements of its gold rush days, with saloons outnumbering churches 3 to 1 and occasional brawls spilling into the muddy Main Street. The town council, composed of the minister, the newspaper editor, and 2 prominent mine owners, welcomed Penelope with a mixture of relief and trepidation. They had indeed been on the verge of offering the teaching position to someone else when she arrived, dusty and exhausted, at the town hall. "We'd begun to fear you weren't coming, Mrs. Lawrence," explained Reverend Porter, a thin, earnest man with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. "School terms already delayed by 2 weeks. I apologize for my tardiness," Penelope replied formally. Travel conditions proved more challenging than anticipated. The living arrangements were less generous than the letter had implied. Instead of a proper house, Penelope was given rooms above the schoolhouse, a converted warehouse at the edge of town. The space was clean but sparse. 1 bedroom, a small sitting area with a cookstove, and a closet-sized room that would have to serve as a nursery for the twins. Still, after 3 days of travel and wilderness hardship, even these humble quarters seemed luxurious. The council wives had provided basic necessities: a bed, a table with chairs, cooking utensils, and a cradle large enough for both babies. Most precious of all, there was a small cast iron bathtub that, when filled with heated water from the stove, offered Penelope her first proper bath since leaving Virginia. That first night in Bannack, as Penelope sat in her nightgown beside the sleeping twins, brushing out her damp hair and watching the town lights flicker through her window. She found her thoughts returning constantly to Isaac. She wondered if he had made it safely back to his cabin, if the wolves had troubled him again, if he thought of her at all. Such thoughts were impractical, she scolded herself. She had a position to establish, 2 infants to raise alone, a new community to navigate. There was no room in her life for romantic daydreams about a cowboy, no matter how kind or handsome he might be. Yet when she finally slept, it was Isaac's blue eyes and gentle hands she dreamed of, not the challenges awaiting her in the morning. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity. The schoolhouse needed substantial preparation before classes could begin. Penelope spent hours scrubbing floors, arranging benches, and creating teaching materials from the limited supplies available. The twins, meanwhile, became minor celebrities in Bannack, with various town matrons stopping by to coo over them and offer child-rearing advice of widely varying usefulness. Mrs. Peterson, the newspaper editor's wife, proved especially helpful, arranging a rotation of young girls to watch the babies during school hours for a modest fee. She also introduced Penelope to the small circle of educated women in town: the doctor's wife, 2 mine owners' spouses, and a surprisingly well-read widow who ran the hotel. "You've caused quite a stir, you know," Mrs. Peterson confided over tea one afternoon. "A young, attractive widow with teaching credentials is practically a unicorn in these parts. Half the unmarried men in town have suddenly developed an interest in education." Penelope laughed, though with some discomfort. She had indeed noticed increased male attention when she ventured into town tips of hats, offers to carry packages, invitations to church socials. All were politely declined. The idea of courtship just 6 months after Thomas's death seemed disrespectful to his memory. And if her heart sometimes quickened at the sight of a tall man in a cowboy hat, who then proved disappointingly not to be Isaac Owens, well, that was her private confusion to manage. School finally began in late February, with 28 pupils ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. Their educational backgrounds varied wildly. Some could barely recognize letters, while others had attended proper schools back east before their families moved west. Managing such diversity proved challenging but rewarding. Penelope found herself drawing on every teaching skill she possessed, often creating individualized lessons for different ability groups. The children, for the most part, were eager learners. Even the older boys, initially resistant to female authority, were won over when Penelope demonstrated a practical approach to mathematics, using mining calculations and supply logistics as examples. By March, Penelope had established a routine that, while exhausting, was sustainable. She rose before dawn to tend to the twins, taught from 8 until 3, cared for her sons in the afternoon while preparing the next day's lessons, and collapsed into bed soon after sunset. Sundays brought a brief respite, though church attendance was an expected part of her role as teacher. It was after one such Sunday service, as Penelope was walking back to the schoolhouse with Samuel and Matthew bundled against the lingering winter chill, that she heard a familiar voice call her name. "Mrs. Lawrence, Penelope." She turned to find Isaac Owens approaching, leading his chestnut horse. He was dressed in what she guessed were his town clothes: a clean shirt with a string tie, dark trousers, and a less weather-beaten hat than the one he'd worn in the wilderness. The sight of him, solid and real after weeks of existing only in her thoughts, made her heart perform a distinctly improper flutter. "Mr. Owens," she greeted him, conscious of the curious glances from churchgoers passing by. "What a pleasant surprise." Isaac reached her side, his eyes immediately going to the twins in their shared perambulator. "They've grown," he observed with obvious delight. "Looking stout and healthy too. They are thriving," Penelope confirmed, unable to keep from smiling at his genuine interest in her sons. "Samuel has learned to roll over, and Matthew is trying to follow his example." "Smart boys," Isaac said approvingly before returning his attention to her. "And you, how are you finding Bannack? Busy but satisfying." The school has 28 pupils now, with more expected when the spring wagon trains arrive. She hesitated, then added, "Would you like to walk with us? I was just returning home." Isaac fell into step beside her, leading his horse. They made quite a picture. Penelope realized the schoolteacher, the cowboy, and the twin babies drawing speculative looks from townsfolk they passed. "I've been meaning to come to town for weeks," Isaac explained as they walked. "But between the late snows and calving season starting early at the ranch, I couldn't get away until today." "Calving season must keep you very busy," Penelope said, genuinely curious about his work. "How many cattle does Silver Creek Ranch run?" "About 800 head now." "Lost some to the harsh winter, but not as many as feared." Pride colored his voice as he added, "Our stock's getting a reputation for hardiness." "Boss has been implementing breeding programs," I suggested, "crossing our longhorns with some Hereford bulls to improve meat quality." The enthusiasm with which he discussed cattle breeding made Penelope smile. "You really love ranching, don't you?" "It gets in your blood," Isaac admitted. "There's something about watching a herd thrive under your care, knowing you're building something lasting." He glanced at her. "Not so different from teaching, I expect, nurturing growth, seeing the results of your work." The comparison surprised and pleased her. "I never thought of it that way, but you're right. There is a similar satisfaction." They reached the schoolhouse, and Penelope hesitated at the bottom of the external staircase that led to her quarters. Propriety suggested she should thank Isaac for escorting her and bid him goodbye. Custom frowned on unmarried women entertaining male visitors alone, even widows. But the thought of sending him away so soon made her unreasonably sad. "Would you like to come up for coffee?" she found herself asking. "If you're not in a hurry to return to the ranch, that is." Something like relief flickered across Isaac's face. "I'd like that very much," he said. "If you're sure it's no imposition with the little ones." "They're due for their nap," Penelope said, leading the way up the stairs. "And I rarely have adult conversation that isn't about spelling tests or town gossip. It would be a welcome change." Inside her quarters, Penelope busied herself settling the twins in their cradle while Isaac politely examined the modest room, commenting on the educational charts she'd created for her pupils. "You made these yourself?" he asked, studying a detailed map of the Montana Territory. "The artistry is impressive. Drawing was my favorite subject at seminary," Penelope admitted, measuring coffee into the pot. "Though I rarely have time for it now except for teaching materials." Once the twins were asleep and coffee was served, they sat at Penelope's small table by the window overlooking the town. The conversation flowed easily between them, picking up as naturally as if their last meeting had been yesterday instead of weeks ago. Isaac told her about the ranch's spring preparations and his continuing plans to purchase his own land. Penelope shared stories about her more memorable students and the challenges of teaching multiple grade levels simultaneously. "I've been using some of your books as inspiration, actually," she confessed. "I remembered titles I saw on your shelf and found a few in the town's lending library." Isaac looked genuinely touched. "Which ones?" "Emerson's essays for the older students. And I've been reading Thoreau's descriptions of Walden Pond to help the younger children understand natural observation." "Good choices," Isaac approved. "Though I admit, I always found Thoreau a bit impractical. Man could wax poetic about self-sufficiency while his mother did his laundry." The comment surprised a laugh from Penelope. "I had similar thoughts. It's easy to philosophize about simple living when you have the option to return to civilization whenever you please." Their discussion ranged from literature to politics, revealing a compatibility of minds that Penelope found increasingly compelling. Isaac's intelligence was grounded in practical experience, but enhanced by wide reading and thoughtful reflection, a combination she had rarely encountered even among educated men back east. When the church bell tolled 3 o'clock, both started in surprise at how much time had passed. "I've kept you too long," Isaac said, rising reluctantly. "You probably have preparations for tomorrow's classes." "I do," Penelope admitted, equally reluctant to end their time together. "But this has been very pleasant." Isaac hesitated at the door. "I'll be coming to town more regularly now that winter's easing. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to call on you again." The formal phrasing, "call on you," carried implications Penelope couldn't pretend to misunderstand. This wasn't just a friendly visit he was proposing, but the beginning of a courtship. She should refuse, she knew. Thomas had been dead less than a year. She had the twins to consider, her position in the community to maintain, her independence to protect. Starting a relationship with anyone, let alone a cowboy whose dreams lay in ranch land miles from town, was impractical at best, foolhardy at worst. Yet looking at Isaac's open, honest face, Penelope couldn't bring herself to say no. Something had begun between them in that cabin during the storm, something she wasn't ready to dismiss. "I would like that," she said simply. The smile that broke across Isaac's face was worth whatever gossip might follow. "Next Sunday, then." "Next Sunday," Penelope agreed. True to his word, Isaac appeared the following Sunday after church. This time he brought gifts, hand-carved wooden rattles for the twins, and for Penelope, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. The thoughtfulness of the presents, clearly selected with care rather than expense in mind, touched her deeply. They established a pattern over the following weeks. Isaac would come to town on Sundays, sometimes staying overnight at the hotel to conduct ranch business on Monday before returning to Silver Creek. Each visit included time with Penelope and the twins, usually at the schoolhouse but occasionally walking through town or picnicking by the creek when weather permitted. The twins, now 7 months old, adored Isaac. Samuel, normally the more reserved of the two, would break into rare smiles at the sound of the cowboy's boots on the stairs. Matthew was even more demonstrative, practically lunging from Penelope's arms whenever Isaac appeared. Bannock society, predictably, took notice. Penelope became aware of whispers and speculative glances when she walked with Isaac. Mrs. Peterson, ever forthright, brought up the subject directly during one of their tea gatherings. "That foreman from Silver Creek seems quite taken with you," she observed, stirring sugar into her cup. "Handsome man, by all accounts reliable, not wealthy but steady employment and good prospects. Mr. Owens is a friend," Penelope replied carefully. "He helped me and the twins during a dangerous situation on our journey here." Mrs. Peterson's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled by the evasion. "Well, friend or otherwise, you could do worse. Several members of the town council have expressed approval, which is more than they'd offer for some of your other admirers." Other admirers. Penelope echoed, genuinely surprised. "My dear, surely you've noticed. Mr. Ferguson from the bank has been maneuvering for an introduction for weeks, and young Dr. Williams changes his route to pass the schoolhouse daily." Mrs. Peterson patted Penelope's hand. "A young widow with your qualities wouldn't remain unattached long in a place where women are still outnumbered 5-1. The conversation left Penelope unsettled. She hadn't considered how her friendship with Isaac might appear to others, nor had she fully acknowledged to herself how her feelings for him had grown. Thomas had been dead only 9 months. Was it disloyal to be developing such strong emotions for another man so soon? Yet when Isaac arrived the following Sunday with a plan to take her and the twins on a proper picnic outside town, Penelope's doubts receded at the simple joy of his company. He had borrowed a light wagon for the occasion, outfitting it with cushions to make it comfortable for the babies. They drove several miles up the creek to a sheltered meadow just beginning to bloom with spring wildflowers. Isaac spread a blanket in the shade of a cottonwood tree, and they enjoyed a feast of fried chicken, biscuits, and preserved peaches that he had somehow procured from the hotel restaurant. The twins, delighted by the new environment, practiced their crawling on the blanket, requiring constant vigilance to keep them from eating grass or small rocks. Isaac proved remarkably adept at baby management, creating impromptu toys from twigs and leaves that captivated the boys' attention. "You're very good with them," Penelope observed as Isaac demonstrated to an entranced Matthew how a bent grass stem could spring back when released. "Most men would find twin infants overwhelming." Isaac looked up, his expression softening. They're fine boys, smart and curious. He tickled Matthew's round belly, eliciting a gurgle of laughter. Besides, I like children. Always figured I'd have a houseful someday. The casual admission hung in the air between them, charged with implication. Penelope busied herself with repacking the picnic basket, suddenly needing a moment to compose herself. Penelope. Isaac's voice drew her eyes back to his face. He had set Matthew beside his brother and moved closer to her on the blanket. There's something I've been wanting to talk to you about. Her heart began beating faster. Yes, I know it hasn't been long since you lost your husband, and I know you've built a life for yourself and the boys in Bannack. He took a deep breath. But these past weeks, spending time with you and the twins, I've come to feel. That is, I hope you might consider. He was interrupted by the distant rumble of approaching horses. Both turned to see a group of riders appearing over the rise, headed in their direction. As they drew closer, Penelope recognized several men from town, including the sheriff and Mr. Chambers, one of the mine owners who sat on the school board. Isaac stood, his expression shifting from disappointment at the interruption to alert wariness as he noted the men's serious faces. Mrs. Lawrence, Sheriff Taylor called as they reined in nearby, thought we might find you out this way. There's been a development you should know about. What's happened? Penelope asked, instinctively gathering the twins closer. Received a telegram from Virginia, the sheriff explained, dismounting. Seems someone's been looking for you. A Mr. James Lawrence says he's your brother-in-law. Penelope felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas's brother, claims to be, the sheriff confirmed. Says he's the legal guardian of your sons, according to their father's will. Wants us to hold you here until he arrives to collect them. The world seemed to tilt beneath Penelope. That's impossible, she managed. Thomas never made a will, and James, we never even met. He was estranged from Thomas for years. Be that as it may, Mr. Chambers interjected, legal claims need proper investigation. The council feels it would be best if you remained in town until this matter is resolved. Isaac had moved to stand beside Penelope, his presence solid and reassuring. On what grounds could a man claim guardianship over his brother's children when their mother is alive and well? He demanded. Especially when he's never even met the boys. That's for a judge to determine, the sheriff replied, though he looked uncomfortable. I'm just relaying the message and the council's request. Request or order, Isaac pressed. Mr. Chambers cleared his throat. Mrs. Lawrence is an employee of the town council. Continued employment is contingent on proper resolution of this matter. Penelope stood, her initial shock giving way to indignant anger. Are you threatening my position, Mr. Chambers? Because a man I've never met makes a claim with no evidence. Not threatening, Chambers backpedaled, simply expressing concern. The school year has only a few weeks remaining. Surely you understand our position. The parents entrust their children to our judgment. And my judgment says Mrs. Lawrence is an excellent teacher and mother, Isaac countered. Anyone suggesting otherwise should have solid proof, not telegrams from unknown parties. The tension crackled between the groups until Sheriff Taylor, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation, suggested everyone return to town to discuss the matter more fully with the entire council. The ride back to Bannack passed in tense silence. Penelope's mind raced with fears and questions. James Lawrence had never shown any interest in his brother's life, let alone his children. Thomas had mentioned him only rarely and never positively. What possible motive could he have for suddenly claiming guardianship of the twins? The answer came during an uncomfortable meeting in the town hall that evening. James Lawrence, it emerged from further telegrams, was asserting that Thomas had left a substantial insurance policy naming his brother as both beneficiary and guardian of any children, should Penelope be deemed unfit. Unfit, Penelope repeated incredulously when this was explained. On what possible grounds? Reverend Porter, who seemed the most sympathetic of the council members, looked pained. The telegram suggests inappropriate behavior unbecoming a widow and mother. Specifically, entertaining male visitors unchaperoned. Penelope felt her cheeks flame with indignation as all eyes in the room briefly flickered to Isaac, who stood beside her chair with a thunderous expression. "This is absurd," she declared. "Even if such accusations weren't grossly exaggerated, how would James Lawrence, thousands of miles away in Virginia, know anything about my life here?" "He claims to have a private investigator's report," the sheriff said. "Man he hired followed you from Virginia, apparently." The realization that she had been watched, her movements reported to a man she'd never met, made Penelope feel physically ill. Beside her, Isaac's hands had clenched into fists. "This sounds like a scheme to get money," he said flatly. "Insurance policy proceeds, I'd wager." "The guardianship claim is just leverage." Several council members nodded, seemingly relieved that someone had stated the obvious. "Be that as it may," Mayor Collins said, "we have a legal obligation to take such claims seriously until they're disproven." "Mrs. Lawrence, no one is suggesting you leave your position or surrender your children. We simply ask that you remain in Bannack until Judge Harmon can review the case. He'll be here on circuit in 3 weeks." 3 weeks, Penelope calculated quickly. If James Lawrence was already traveling west, as the telegram suggested, he could arrive before the judge. What then? Would she be forced to surrender her sons to a stranger on nothing more than his word? "I'll be staying in town until this is resolved," Isaac announced unexpectedly. "Silver Creek can spare me for a few weeks." His declaration brought both relief and concern to Penelope. His presence would be a comfort and protection, but it might also fuel the very rumors James Lawrence was using against her. As if reading her thoughts, Mrs. Peterson, who had joined the meeting as a concerned friend, spoke up. "Mrs. Lawrence and her sons will stay with my family until this matter is settled. That should address any concerns about propriety." The council accepted this compromise, and the meeting adjourned with assurances that telegrams would be sent seeking verification of James Lawrence's claims. Penelope left feeling both supported by her new community and deeply shaken by this threat to everything she had built. The next 3 weeks passed in a haze of anxiety and preparation. Penelope continued teaching, though she found it difficult to focus with the constant worry about her son's future. In the evenings, she pored over legal textbooks borrowed from the town's only lawyer, searching for precedents that might protect her rights as a mother. Isaac, true to his word, remained in Bannack, taking a room at the hotel and helping Penelope's case by gathering statements from witnesses who had known Thomas Lawrence, testimony that might disprove his brother's claims. He also sent telegrams to contacts in Virginia, seeking information about James Lawrence's character and financial situation. The Petersons proved to be tremendous allies. Their home was comfortable, their children welcoming to the twins, and their social standing in Bannack unimpeachable. Mrs. Peterson, in particular, became a fierce advocate, organizing the town's leading women to support Penelope publicly. No decent mother should live in fear of having her children taken by distant relatives with suspicious motives, she declared at a hastily convened meeting of the Ladies' Aid Society. Especially not a widow who has shown remarkable strength and capability in the face of adversity. Despite this support, Penelope found herself withdrawing from Isaac, maintaining a formal distance whenever they met. The accusation of inappropriate behavior had struck a sensitive chord. While she knew their relationship had been entirely proper, she couldn't help wondering if her growing feelings for him had somehow been improper so soon after Thomas's death. Isaac noticed the change but didn't press her, respecting her need for space during this crisis. Still, she caught the hurt in his eyes when she declined his offers of companionship beyond practical assistance with her legal troubles. 10 days before the judge was due to arrive, a dusty stagecoach delivered James Lawrence to Bannack. He proved to be a florid-faced man in his 40s, expensively if garishly dressed, with a superficial charm that didn't reach his calculating eyes. He took rooms at the hotel and immediately began cultivating relationships with the more influential men in town, buying rounds of drinks and telling elaborate tales of business success back east. Penelope, summoned to a formal meeting with him and several council members, found him both condescending and evasive. He expressed exaggerated concern for his poor brother's sons while barely glancing at the twins, who regarded him with the solemn wariness babies often show to strangers. "My dear sister-in-law," he said with a smile that didn't warm his eyes, "I understand your maternal attachment, of course, but a woman alone can hardly provide the guidance and opportunities these boys deserve. The Lawrence name carries weight in Virginia business circles, advantages you simply cannot offer them here in this." He glanced around dismissively. "Frontier environment. These advantages being the insurance money you claim Thomas left," Penelope challenged. James's smile tightened. "Among other assets, Thomas was more prudent in his financial planning than perhaps you realized." "My husband and I had no secrets," Penelope replied evenly. "If such policies or assets existed, I would know of them." The discussion grew increasingly tense until Mayor Collins suggested they adjourn until the judge's arrival. As James Lawrence rose to leave, he leaned close to Penelope with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This could be resolved amicably, you know," he murmured. "A simple agreement dividing the insurance proceeds, say, 60% to me as guardian, 40% to you. You could keep teaching, see the boys on holidays. Everyone satisfied." The naked avarice of the proposal, disguised as compromise, confirmed Isaac's assessment of the man's motives. Penelope straightened her spine and met his gaze directly. "My sons are not bargaining chips, Mr. Lawrence, nor will I surrender a penny of any money rightfully theirs, should such funds actually exist." His expression hardened. "Then I'm afraid this will become unpleasant. A widow in your circumstances, limited means, questionable associations rarely fares well in custody matters." Before Penelope could retort, Isaac stepped forward from where he had been standing quietly by the door. "Mrs. Lawrence isn't as alone as you might think," he said, his voice level but carrying an unmistakable undertone of warning. "This community stands behind her, as do I." James Lawrence's eyes narrowed as he assessed Isaac, taking in the cowboy's weather-beaten face and capable hands. "Ah yes, the ranch hand. Precisely the sort of support that concerns me for my nephew's moral upbringing." The insult hung in the air for a moment before Isaac replied with dangerous calm. "I'm Silver Creek's foreman, and if you're suggesting impropriety between Mrs. Lawrence and myself, you'd be wise to retract that implication immediately." Mayor Collins cleared his throat nervously. "Gentlemen, please, let's leave these matters for Judge Harmon to evaluate." The confrontation set the tone for the tense days that followed. James Lawrence continued his campaign to win over influential townspeople, while simultaneously spreading subtle insinuations about Penelope's relationship with Isaac. Some townsfolk were swayed by his apparent wealth and connections. Others remained firmly supportive of their teacher. The twins, sensitive to the tension around them, became fussier than usual. Penelope found herself sleeping poorly, waking from nightmares in which her sons were taken from her arms by faceless authorities. The strain began to show in her teaching, though she struggled to maintain normalcy for her pupils' sake. It was during this darkest period, 4 days before the judge's expected arrival, that Isaac came to the Petersons' home one evening with news. "May I speak with you privately?" he asked Penelope after greeting Mrs. Peterson. "It's important." They stepped onto the back porch, where the spring evening was cool but pleasant. Penelope wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, as much for comfort as warmth. "What is it?" she asked, noting the intensity in Isaac's expression. "I received a reply to one of my telegrams," he said, producing a folded paper from his pocket, "from the sheriff in Richmond who investigated your husband's death." Penelope took the telegram with trembling fingers. The message was brief but clear. No insurance policy had been found among Thomas Lawrence's effects or records. Moreover, Thomas had filed papers explicitly naming Penelope as his children's guardian should anything happen to him. These documents had been properly witnessed and recorded with the city authorities. "He did make provisions," Penelope whispered, tears springing to her eyes. "Just not the kind James claimed." There's more, Isaac said, his voice gentle. The sheriff included information about James Lawrence's current legal troubles in Virginia. He's wanted for questioning in a real estate scheme that defrauded several investors. Left town just ahead of the authorities, apparently. Relief and vindication washed through Penelope in equal measure. This proves he's lying about everything. It's strong evidence, Isaac agreed. I've already shown copies to the mayor and sheriff. They're considering how to proceed. Penelope looked up at him, suddenly aware of how much he had done for her the time away from his work, the telegrams sent at his own expense, the steadfast support when others wavered. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I can ever repay you for all this." Isaac stepped closer, his eyes serious in the fading light. "I didn't do it for repayment, Penelope." He hesitated, then continued more softly. "These past weeks, keeping my distance because I understood your concerns. It's been difficult. I've missed you." Missed what was growing between us before this trouble started. The simple honesty of his words broke through the protective wall Penelope had built around her heart. "I've missed you too," she admitted. "But I was afraid of giving James Lawrence more ammunition, afraid of what people might think, afraid of my own feelings when I should still be mourning Thomas." "There's no proper timetable for the heart," Isaac said, reaching out to take her hand. "And I think Thomas would want you and his sons to be happy, not alone." Before Penelope could respond, the back door opened, and Mrs. Peterson appeared, looking apologetic but urgent. "Forgive the interruption, but Sheriff Taylor is here," she said. "James Lawrence has disappeared from the hotel, along with all his belongings. The stagecoach driver says he paid double for a seat on tonight's eastbound coach." The news threw the town into brief confusion. A hasty meeting of the council confirmed what Penelope and Isaac already knew. James Lawrence had been running a confidence scheme, hoping to claim money that didn't exist. His abrupt departure when faced with evidence from Virginia confirmed his guilt. 2 days later, Judge Harmon arrived as scheduled. After reviewing all the documentation, including the telegram from Richmond and statements from council members about James Lawrence's behavior, he issued a clear ruling. Penelope was and would remain the sole legal guardian of her sons, with full rights to any assets from Thomas Lawrence's estate. The relief that washed through Bannack was palpable. The school term ended on a high note, with parents expressing renewed confidence in their teacher. Penelope, free from the shadow of losing her sons, found herself able to look forward rather than constantly watching over her shoulder. 1 week after the judge's ruling, Isaac invited Penelope and the twins for another picnic, this time to see the land he hoped to purchase for his ranch. It was a beautiful piece of property, with rolling hills perfect for grazing and a clear creek running through a protected valley. "The owners agreed to my offer," Isaac told her as they sat beneath a spreading oak tree watching the twins attempt to crawl through the thick grass. "It'll be mine officially next month. It's beautiful," Penelope said sincerely. "Everything you described." Isaac seemed uncharacteristically nervous, repeatedly adjusting his hat and clearing his throat before finally turning to face her directly. "The thing is," he began, "a ranch this size needs more than one person to run it properly. And a house which I plan to build right there on that rise, it needs a family to make it a home." Penelope's heart began to beat faster as she recognized the direction of his words. "I know it might seem sudden," Isaac continued, taking her hands in his, "but I think we both know what's been growing between us since that day on the Washout, when I saw you there with your babies, so determined despite everything you were facing. I admired you from that first moment. And everything since has only deepened that feeling into something more." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a small pearl. "I'm not a wealthy man yet, Penelope. But I promise you this, if you'll have me, I'll spend every day working to give you and the boys a good life. I'll love them as my own sons, and I'll love you with everything I have for as long as I live." Tears blurred Penelope's vision as emotions overwhelmed her: joy, hope, a touch of fear at this new beginning, and underneath it all, a certainty that had been building since those days in Isaac's cabin. "The ranch is 10 miles from Bannack," she said, her practical side asserting itself even as her heart had already decided. "The school." "I've thought about that," Isaac assured her. "We could keep rooms in town during the school year if you want to continue teaching. Or hire a wagon to take you back and forth. Or," he added with a small smile, "the ranch is growing fast enough that we might need our own schoolhouse before long. There are 5 families with children within riding distance already." Penelope looked at his earnest face, then at her sons playing nearby, then at the beautiful land spread before them, land that could be their home, their future. "Yes," she said simply, her heart too full for elaborate speeches. "Yes, I will marry you, Isaac." His face lit with a joy that matched her own as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a kiss that was both gentle and filled with promise. When they separated, he immediately scooped up the twins, one in each arm, spinning them around until they squealed with delight. "What do you think, boys?" he asked them as if they could understand. "Ready to be ranchers?" Matthew grabbed for Isaac's beard while Samuel simply studied him with his serious dark eyes before breaking into one of his rare, beautiful smiles. "I think that's a yes," Penelope laughed, her heart lighter than it had been in more than a year. They were married 2 weeks later in Bannack's small church. The entire town turned out for the ceremony with Mrs. Peterson standing as Penelope's attendant and Daniel from Silver Creek serving as Isaac's best man. The twins, dressed in matching outfits sewn by the Ladies' Aid Society, were passed among adoring townswomen during the reception. As a wedding gift, the town council surprised Penelope with an offer she hadn't expected. They asked if she would consider continuing as Bannack's teacher even after her marriage, perhaps on a modified schedule that would accommodate her new life at the ranch. "We recognize good teaching when we see it," Mayor Collins said, somewhat sheepishly after his earlier wavering during the James Lawrence affair. "And the children have made remarkable progress under your guidance." Isaac, standing proudly beside his new wife, supported the idea completely. "Education's important," he said firmly. "Worth making accommodations for. We'll figure out the practicalities," and they did. Over the following year, Isaac built not only the home he had promised on the rise overlooking the creek, but also a small one-room schoolhouse halfway between the ranch and Bannack. 3 days a week, Penelope taught there, welcoming both town children whose parents were willing to make the journey and the children from neighboring ranches who had previously had no access to formal education. The ranch, which they named Twin Creeks in honor of both the water sources on the property and the twin boys who brought them together, prospered under Isaac's knowledgeable management. His breeding programs proved successful, and within 3 years, their herd was considered among the finest in the territory. Samuel and Matthew thrived in the ranch environment, growing from babies to sturdy toddlers with Isaac's patient guidance alongside their mothers. Though they never knew their birth father, they grew up with Thomas Lawrence's portrait in the family parlor and stories of his quick mind and love for their mother. On the twins' 2nd birthday, Isaac formally adopted them, though he had been their father in every way that mattered since the day he carried them through the storm. The ceremony at the county courthouse was brief but emotional, with both Penelope and Isaac blinking back tears as the judge declared them legally a family. That same year brought another cause for celebration when Penelope discovered she was expecting their first child together. Elizabeth Jane Owens arrived the following spring, a daughter with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. 2 years later, she was joined by a brother, William Thomas, completing their family. On warm summer evenings, when the ranch work was done and the children were playing in the yard of the home they had built together, Penelope and Isaac often sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in spectacular colors. "Do you ever think about that day at the Washout?" Penelope asked one such evening, her head resting against Isaac's shoulder. "How differently things might have gone if you hadn't come along when you did." Isaac's arm tightened around her. "I thank God every day that I was there," he said simply. Best decision I ever made, offering to carry those boys. I was so frightened when you first approached, Penelope admitted with a smile, this tall stranger appearing out of the storm, asking to take one of my babies. And now look at us, Isaac chuckled, gesturing to where the twins, now 5 years old, were teaching 3-year-old Elizabeth how to rope a fence post while baby William watched from his blanket. 4 children, a growing ranch, and you still the prettiest schoolteacher in the territory. And you still the most charming cowboy, Penelope returned, turning to press a kiss to his weathered cheek. Their life wasn't without challenges, harsh winters, cattle disease, the occasional drought, but they faced each obstacle together with the same determination that had brought them through their first trials. The school Penelope started eventually grew into a proper district school, with her serving as head teacher until their youngest was ready for college. The twins, so tiny and vulnerable when Isaac first carried them, grew into fine young men with their father's love of the land and their mother's passion for learning. Samuel eventually took over management of Twin Creeks Ranch, while Matthew studied law and returned to help establish Montana's statehood. And through it all, through decades of change as the frontier gave way to civilization, as territories became states and cattle drives gave way to railroads, Penelope and Isaac's love remained the constant center of their world, a love born in crisis, tested by hardship and proven unbreakable by time. When visitors asked how they met, Isaac would always begin the story the same way. She was staggering with twins on a washout, and I said, "Give me one, I'll carry both if needed." And Penelope would smile, remembering how those simple words had changed everything, how the offer of help from a stranger had become the foundation of a lifetime of love.